is when we went to DC, one of the things that the conference was trying to address is the fact that the anti-war movement is increasingly aging, and the participation of youth is kind of small. So that's something that we are trying to fix by having events like this, because young people, need to be engaged in the anti-war cause, because war hasn't gone away, and it's still a threat to human survival. And I think engaged in it, engaged. I think my generation, the millennials, are quite engaged in politics with things like Black Lives Matter movement. They were, I think, the biggest supporters of Bernie Sanders. So I think people are thinking, but we need to be thinking a little bit more about war in the world. Anyway, so my name is Randy La Prairie, and second-year master's student at the Department of Sociology. And this talk is based on my thesis research. I think Ron already talked about my public sociology proclivities, so I'll skip that and just go right to my research. What I'm doing in my thesis is testing something called the propaganda model. And the propaganda model is a structural model of the mass media that comes from a book that was co-authored by Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman, an infamous book you've probably heard of, and if you haven't read it, you should read it. It's called Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media. And I read this book several years ago, and it just changed everything for me. I thought, wow, I wish somebody would have told me about this when I was an undergraduate or when I was in high school, because it completely changed the way that I thought about the world, and about the mass media, and about the kind of messages that we hear all the time, about our country and about why we go to war. And the interesting thing about it is that it's an incredibly powerful model. Its explanatory power is incredible. It's been confirmed again and again in several studies. But these studies, interestingly, are usually, first of all, they're mostly European scholars who are looking at these kinds of things, not American scholars. And they're not sociologists, which maybe you could understand. It's usually communications theorists, media scholars. But sociologists tend not to pay attention to this, which is strange, because the mass media is one of the major, what we call the institutions of socialization in advanced developed societies. So it's quite important to understand how it works. And so I wanted to test this model. And the way that I was going to test it was by looking at how the news media, covered the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya. So before I get into that and the details of what happened in Libya and how the media covered it, I'll talk a little bit about the model itself. I was going to spend more time on it, but I could probably talk for like a half hour about the structure of the media, and it would get really boring. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes generally about what the media is and the kind of function that it serves in our society. What I'd like to say first, I think, is I'd like to suggest that the media, it's basically a propaganda system for the elite, for the people that basically run this country. Okay? It's a propaganda system for the state, and it's a propaganda system for the corporate sector. And usually when we think about propaganda, we think about something that's much more, kind of crude. We might think of like the Soviet Union or something in the 1940s, those kinds of posters. Or we might think of like, posters from Nazi Germany. But I think what the propaganda model suggests, and what I would like to suggest, is that propaganda is something much more sophisticated. It's something that's much more insidious that we need to understand. And what I would suggest is that every time that you turn on the TV, every time you turn on the television news, every time you pick up a mainstream newspaper, it doesn't matter if it's NPR, it doesn't matter if it's D.C. It doesn't matter if it's the New York Times. It doesn't matter if it's Fox News. What you're getting is propaganda, essentially. Okay? Because there is a remarkable uniformity across all mainstream news outlets. And as I've just said, this uniformity is a kind of conformity to elite opinion and elite perspective. And what the propaganda model predicts is this, that what you see in the media will, like I said, will reflect elite opinions. And well, you might say, well, they debate about stuff all the time. The Democrats and the Republicans debate, and this is covered, and there's all kinds of debate raging in this country in politics. But the thing is that all of this debate that we see in the media and that we hear, most of it, I would argue, is occurring within the consensus, a certain kind of consensus, elite consensus, where the elites have a strong agreement on things. You won't see debate about it. So where the elite might disagree, or they simply don't care, if it's something like gun control, maybe a while back, it's changing now, but or abortion or school prayer or something like that, we can see all kinds of debate. But there's other areas where you won't see any debate, really at all. And I would suggest that there are kind of two major areas. One is capitalism. The merits, I think, of capitalism are never seriously questioned. Capitalism is never seriously critiqued. Now, you might say, well, what about Bernie Sanders? Didn't Bernie Sanders have a kind of critique of capitalism? Wasn't he a socialist? Maybe. I would suggest that what Bernie Sanders has done is he's kind of pointed out maybe the excesses of capitalism and criticized them. But I don't think Bernie Sanders and I don't think the mass media has offered us a very fundamental critique of capitalism, the very fundamental social relations of capitalism. So that's one thing where you'll never see really any disagreement. The second thing is this, and this is important for the context of the discussion of Libya. The other thing that's not ever really questioned is American exceptionalism. Okay? I need to get some water. Hold on. My lapel mic would work. And if you don't know what I mean by American exceptionalism is this. It's in foreign affairs. It's the idea that we do good in the world. We are a force for good in the world. When we go to war, when we intervene in other countries, it's because we're motivated by lofty principles of democracy and freedom and liberty and justice, right? All these kind of great things. This is why we go to war. This is why we fought World War II, right? We had to fight fascism, and so on. That's why we go to war, okay? And it's never because of material interests. It's never because the capitalist class wants to exploit resources in the third world. It's never because the capitalist class wants to exploit third world labor. It's always because of these lofty principles, okay? And sometimes we're defending ourselves. We have to defend ourselves from the enemies. During the Cold War period, we had to defend ourselves from the communists. The communists were everywhere. In fact, even places they weren't. They were there. We had to go and fight them. So we're either defending ourselves or we're upholding these really lofty interests. You will hear some kind of debate that goes like this. Well, we made a mistake. We shouldn't have invaded Iraq. We had good intentions, but it turned out to be bad because the Iraqi people, they just kind of aren't ready for democracy. They're too primitive for that or something like that. So we sometimes make mistakes, okay? But the thing is our foreign policy objectives are never wrong. They're never just flat out wrong. They're never really strongly criticized as being illegal, and they're never wrong. Okay? We always have good intentions. We're a force for good in the world. So these are things, kind of consistencies in the mainstream media that I think are virtually never questioned. There might be some exceptions here and there, but that is kind of the nature of our mass media system in the United States. And just to kind of flesh this out a little bit more, the reason for this, of course, isn't because there's some, because there's some, it's my partner, by the way, who's actually working right now. But the reason for this isn't because there's some like cabal of guys sitting in the back room planning what the next day's news is. It's not like this crude thing. It's an institutional process. Okay? To make a kind of analogy, we talk about institutional racism, right? So the police, we might say, is a racist institution, and it's not necessarily because the police are racists and they don't mean well, but the consequences of the policing system are very racist. And similarly, the mass media that we have is a very biased system. It's biased to the interests of the elites. And this isn't because individual journalists are necessarily biased. A lot of individual journalists, especially intelligent journalists, understand how all this works. But there are structural forces on the mass media that cause it to behave this way. And there's a lot of things we could talk about, but the main reason is the fact that the media in this country are private corporations themselves. They're extremely large corporations that have several links to the corporate community through their directorates, through structures of ownership. So the way that this happens isn't through crude state intervention or something like that. It's because the people who own these institutions and control them and manage them select right-thinking people to fill management positions, to fill editorial positions, journalistic positions. Okay, and so we get this kind of ideological uniformity in the mass media, any particular outlet and across the industry. And again, like I said, the result of this is we get this very elite bias in the media. To give a kind of indication of this, I want to do a little audience participation really quick. I want to ask you guys a question. KNOW people aren't really allowed to answer because I think you already know this trick. I want to ask you to kind of get a sense of how this system works. Tell me, raise your hand, I'll call on you. Where do you think, in which country, is the most deadly conflict occurring today? Syria. Anyone else?
Has to be somewhere on the continent of Africa.
Somewhere on the continent of Africa. Anyone else?
Haiti.
Say again.
Haiti.
Haiti.
Oh,
Anyone else?
Korea.
Korea?
Yes.
We'll take one more. United States. United States. I would argue that the world's deadliest conflict is occurring in Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo. Since 1996, nearly 6 million people have been killed. 6 million. Okay. And I would suggest that the reason that we don't hear about this is, well, one of the reasons is Africa just isn't covered that much in the Western media. But the other reason is because there are a lot of corporate interests inside Congo. Congo is extremely rich in resources. There are American corporations there that are buying coltan and selling it to, or using it to create parts for our cell phones and our computer, and they're selling it to the big electronics corporations. And I would argue that this is the reason that we are not hearing about this in the West. Because if it was happening in Europe, it would be an outrage. So anyway, I think that just gives you an idea of how powerful this system is and kind of influencing the way that we think about the world. The propaganda model doesn't actually predict or make any predictions about how people might be affected by the media system, but I think it's pretty apparent that this system is extremely powerful. Okay, so anyway, getting to the kind of title of the talk, how the media sells war, and looking at the case of Libya. Libya. So the kind of story that was told about Libya to justify the US-led NATO intervention was that Gaddafi was an awful dictator who was killing his own people. This was the narrative. He declared war on his own people, and he was on the verge of carrying out a mass atrocity in Benghazi, and if not a genocide. And by intervening in Libya and taking out Gaddafi, we prevented the deaths of hundreds, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. That was Barack Obama's claim after the fact. But I think if you look at the facts, which is what we'll do right now, the story is rather different. So let's take a look at the facts. Let's talk about the histories. Let's talk about a little bit of historical background going into the 90s to kind of, to establish the fact that there were very important geopolitical interests in Libya. So then we can see how the mass media would have been so eager to support the Obama administration and the corporate sector in their goals of getting rid of Gaddafi, even though that wasn't the original goal. So Libya was always kind of in tension with the West, going back to at least 1969, which was the revolution, the Libyan Revolution that brought Gaddafi to power. And it was mostly a bloodless revolution. It was very popular. And Gaddafi developed the country. By the 1980s, there was a very well-developed middle class. The country was doing pretty well. It had to deal with some Western U.S. subversion in the 80s under the Reagan administration. That affected it. It was at war with Chad for a little bit in the late 80s. But, you know, it wasn't doing that bad. In fact, Libya was fourth for, well, let's do it like this. I think it was 55th out of something like 177 countries on the United Nations Human Development Index. It was first among all African countries, and it was fourth among all Arab countries. I think the literacy rate was something like 90%. But, so it was doing pretty well. The problem with Libya, of course, was that it wasn't very democratic. Gaddafi was, of course, a dictator. And the middle class started to demand more political power. They wanted a more democratic system. Okay? And as a result of Western United Nations sanctions, the weight and the expense of the state bureaucracy, the economy didn't do very well. And then something else happened in the 90s. Gaddafi kind of had a pivot away from Arab states to African states because I guess he had some treaties with the Arab countries that didn't quite work out. So he turned to Africa, and he developed this strong pan-Africanist foreign policy. And Libya began investing immensely across Africa. Libya was by far the largest investor in African development and infrastructure, and they helped many countries. And Libya gained a lot of political capital through this kind of investment. Something else that Libya did, or Gaddafi did, it was he helped found something called the African Union. Okay, the African Union was an intergovernmental body that was intended to do a number of things. Let me say this: it was founded in 1999 in Sirte, Libya, actually. Okay, and Gaddafi was one of the leading founders of it. But so anyway, the point of the African Union was to do a number of things. One of the major objectives of the African Union was to create a kind of autonomous monetary zone for Africa, so that Africa could develop its own economy, so that Africa could develop a value-added economy instead of an export-oriented economy that kept it dependent on Western countries, on the West, on the United States and Europe. So it wanted to have an economy that would benefit its own people. they were going to create their own institutions. Well, there were institutions in place to facilitate this. And eventually they wanted to have their own kind of central banking system, something sort of like the IMF, but without structural adjustments tied to it. So that was one thing that Gaddafi and the African Union were doing. And it wasn't just Gaddafi who was doing this stuff. When you hear this stuff, when you read about this stuff in the media sometimes, or in like more mainstream accounts, they kind of try to attribute these things to like, oh, it was all Gaddafi doing this stuff, it was all Gaddafi. But these policies were extremely popular among African leaders. So economic independence was one goal of the African Union. Another goal of the African Union was military defense. They wanted to have a common, unified military defense system. And this was especially troubling for the West. It was especially troubling for the United States, because in 2007, the United States, of course, put AFRICOM into Africa. And it was in 1999 that 2009, that the African Union voted to put in place a kind of common defense system for Africa. Okay. Western planners did not like any of this. Okay. All of this was upsetting to the West. And we know this, among other reasons, from the WikiLeaks diplomatic cable leaks in 2010, okay, where we could see very clearly the way that American diplomats were responding to these things that they were seeing at all these African Union summits, okay? And they weren't pleased about it. They were nervous about it, and they wanted to see these things fail. And they were hopeful that they would. And they thought they would too, because the diplomats, like Jean Kretz was the diplomat in Libya, observed that these Pan-Africanist policies of Gaddafi were not popular inside Libya. The Arab population especially resented it, because they saw Gaddafi pouring all this oil wealth into Africa while the Libyan economy kind of stagnated. So these weren't popular things. Gaddafi wasn't really popular to begin with. Another thing that Gaddafi did that his Arab population didn't like was that he opened up the borders to migration for migrant workers. African migrant workers could come freely into Libya, and they did. And they came and they filled mostly menial labor positions. They filled large portions of the agricultural industry and the construction industry. And all of these things actually fanned anti-black African racism inside Libya. It was pretty severe. In fact, in the year 2000, after a small economic crisis, there were pogroms, mass pogroms across Libya, in which several Libyan cities, in which perhaps hundreds of black Africans were lynched and butchered. So this was happening. Okay? This was existing inside Libya. And this is important to remember, because as I start talking about the intervention in 2011, this ugly racism is going to crop its head up again. So remember this. So anyway, let's fast forward to 2011. In February 15th, which is actually my birthday, protests erupted in Benghazi. They were met with repression from Gaddafi's security forces, brutal repression, murderous repression, which was normal for the Gaddafi regime. But in the context of the Arab Spring, the protesters were not going to give up. So they kept at it. And what we heard in what you would hear in the mainstream narrative about what happened was that these were peaceful protesters. Right? These were peaceful protesters who wanted democracy. The thing is that narrative was only true for about 2 days. The protests began on February 15th. By the 17th, you could read in the New York Times, in fact, that the protesters were armed with gasoline bombs and rocks. But anyway, they became increasingly violent. They, in fact, took over a police station and burned it down. And by February 18th, in certain cities, let me get my notes here. Sound like I know what I'm talking about. On February 18th, my point is going to be in Derna and Al-Baida, excuse me. These are cities in eastern Libya. According to an anti-Gaddafi activist, and you couldn't read this in the New York Times, but you could read this in The Guardian, and you could read it in Al Jazeera, February 18th, according to an activist, the rebels captured a military base in Al-Baida and executed 50 black mercenaries and 2 Gaddafi loyalists. In Derna, the activist claimed, this is what he said, quote, a number of conspirators were executed. They were locked up in holding cells in the police station because they resisted, and some died burning inside the building. So these were the peaceful protesters.